All right, we are recording here. Welcome everybody to the new normal. I think we will learn to adapt as necessary to this new exciting challenge here. Let me, really quick, actually I'm gonna pull this up. If you have questions, don't unmute yourself. Because we run into people talking over each other and all that confusing stuff. I'm going to ask that y'all just type your questions in the chat bubble. And so you should have all gotten a notification that I am typing in that chat. Sorry, Viviana. Yep, there you go. Cool. So you all see it. That's where you can ask questions. We're going to have a lot of stuff to get through today. So ask questions. I may pause a couple of times to see if anybody has questions. But feel free to actually ask questions. Let's try not to spam this so I can see if people actually do have questions that come up. But yeah, ask your questions in there if you do have any questions that arise. So let me go ahead and share the PowerPoint here. If you want to access the PowerPoint, you can do so. It is online, but you will hopefully have this here in a way that allows you to see what I am seeing and see my actual cursor as I'm going over. So again, if you have any questions, if you've just joined us, please type it in the little chat bubble there, and we will get started. So I'm going to do, screw that. I will just do full screen here and move things around as I need to. All right, so today we're talking about emotion, stress, and health, and also drives. If you look at the syllabus, drives is supposed to be on Thursday, but if you got that email from the president, you know that classes are canceled Thursday and Friday and Monday. Tuesday, there was not supposed to be any class because we were going to have Honors Day. Now, we're clearly not having Honors Day anymore. And so while I don't know what the university's policy is about class, I'm going to hold a review session during that class period. And so if y'all want to jump on here onto Zoom, I'll post another meeting link so we can actually do a review session if you have questions about the exam. Very cute dog there, Ashton. All right, yeah, so no class on Thursday. So we're going to cram in the rest of our stress and health as well as drives today. Doing that review session during the normal class period on Tuesday. And then with everything going on, I decided to go ahead and just extend the Cengage for Chapter 9 and Chapter 13. I think Chapter 9 was already due. Chapter 13, I think, is due by tomorrow night, normally. They're both now due the 13th of April. And so you can get them going after spring break if you want to, or you can work on them now. But it should at least give you a little bit of time to kind of navigate the craziness associated with getting off campus, getting home, learning this whole online thing. And then your exam will still be a week from this Thursday. It's going to be online. It's going to be open book, open note. That does mean it's going to be a harder exam, though. So to account for the fact that you're going to have access to your exams, no, you won't be using Lockdown browser. It's just going to be open book, open notes. That way, that helps mitigate against anybody, potentially cheating. I know there were some concerns about Lockdown browser or video camera monitoring. This way, you can access all your notes, all your book, whatever you want to do. But like I said, it is going to be a harder exam, so don't expect to just be able to study and come in without notes, because it will be harder than the previous exams. Additionally, don't just expect that you can come in with your notes and do well in the exam, because there are going to be enough questions, but also the difficulty of the questions will be such that you're not going to have time to go through and look for every possible answer in the book. and your notes if you have not studied. So please do study. The exam, excuse me, will be up only for the amount of time of class. It'll be released at the beginning of class. It'll close at the end of class. So do plan to take it during your class time. And if you normally take the exam with testing services, you take more than the normal class allotment time, please send me an email so I can extend your amount of time for the exam on Canvas. And the exams will all be posted on Canvas under the actual quizzes section. If you have any more questions, go ahead and post them in the chat box. If you have the book and notes, would you be able to use it while taking the exam? Yeah, I mean, you can use just about anything except for your other classmates or other people. Will you be able to use the book and notes on the computer? Yeah, it's not going to be a lockdown browser. So unless Canvas does something weird when you're taking quizzes of not letting you go to other tabs, I think you'll be fine. I don't think it should be an issue. Of course. All right, here's your first fun fact of the day. In the 1830s, ketchup was sold as medicine. As somebody who's still addicted to ketchup, I think it does have medicinal properties. While the rest of y'all were hoarding up on toilet paper, I was hoarding ketchup. And because you're not getting a class on Thursday, excuse me, you do get a second fun fact of the day. I don't know who's making that noise, but I'm going to mute you all. All right, I still don't know. All right, well, it's gone away. All right, so second fun fact of the day. Someone once paid $10,000 for a, quote, non-visible sculpture created by actor James Franco. The artwork was billed as an endless tank of oxygen. It's almost as stupid as that banana on the wall that sold for like $150,000. All right, so last time Jonathan talked to y'all about stress in the body. Some of this may be, yeah, I saw somebody eat that banana. So some of this may be a review, but for the most part, I'm going to try to only talk about new stuff. It's going to be a lot of stuff in this presentation, so I'm going to go through pretty quick. On a lot of the slides, I've included a lot of text. Again, all the slides are online, so you don't have to worry about copying them down verbatim. And that way, if we go over them really quickly, you can at least go back and get the gist of the actual slides. And yes, I am drinking out of a massive Ocean Spray bottle because I'm at home and I can do what I want. All right, so emotion. I mean, you all have kind of that colloquial sense of what emotion is, just the response of the whole organism, including the physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and your conscious experience. So that sort of phenomenological experience of the emotion, what it feels like to be happy, what it feels like to be sad, etc. And there are several different theories about this sort of emotion and arousal. So Jonathan should have talked about last week the appraisal process of emotion and the arousal. But there are several different theories that kind of speak to the ordering of that. And so the James Lange theory suggests that our experience of emotion is our awareness of our physiological responses to an emotion arousing stimulus. And so that our experience of emotion comes after that sort of physiological arousal. And it's causing, that physiological arousal is causing us to appraise the arousal as a certain specific emotion. The Cannon-Barth theory, on the other hand, suggests that the emotion arousing stimulus simultaneously triggers the physiological reaction and the subjective experience of emotion. And so whereas James Lange would suggest that arousal precedes the emotional experience, the Cannon-Barth theory would suggest that simultaneously arousal and emotion come about. So it's not like you are appraising that arousal to get that emotion, they're coming about at the same time. And then we have the two-factor theory. And so this theory suggests that to experience emotion, you have to be physically aroused and then cognitively label that arousal. And so this would suggest that there's non-emotion in the absence of arousal. Now, because of this sort of appraisal, this cognitive appraisal of arousal, you can get situations wherein you're sort of misattributing that arousal. So, for example, you may feel if you drink a lot of coffee or have a lot of Red Bulls on any given day, you feel extra anxious. And it's because you're cognitively reappraising that sort of arousal associated with the caffeine consumption as being anxiety or feelings of anxiety. And that's why if people do have actual anxiety issues, one of the things that may happen is you first go in and you get full workups, full physical workups, because there could be some non-psychological, but rather physiological or biological cause of that heightened level of arousal that's then leading to you attributing it to anxiety. So again, if y'all have questions at any point, feel free to type them in the Zoom chat here. And so we have two different kind of pathways we can think about in our brain. We have what we kind of call the old brain or the reptilian brain. And then we have our new brain. And the new brain is what makes us human, right? It's our cerebral cortex. And so our old brain is really designed to keep us alive, right? Our old brain is what is going to elicit these sort of startle responses. It's going to be what gives us anxiety about certain situations, what triggers that fight or flight. And then the new brain is this sort of cognitive appraisal of everything going on. It's the attempt to try to make sense of everything. And so you can think about this interesting sort of interaction, right? Your old brain is constantly trying to keep you alive from this sort of survival perspective. However, that does mean it's going to find reasons to be anxious about just about anything, right? Think about a deer, for example, a quintessential prey animal. Deer are incredibly skittish, right? Every little thing that comes into their world is enough to send them off running. We have that same sort of proclivity in our brain, our old brain, kind of the central parts of our brain, first things to develop. And yet our new brain is still trying to make sense of all of those skittish signals, especially now that we are in relative comfort. Our brain is still trying to make sense of things that we feel are triggering anxiety. And that's why a lot of people will start developing anxiety disorders, because they start paying attention and start attributing to certain things in their life this sort of anxiety. It's not just the James Lange and Cannon-Bard theory that we should be considering, though, about all of this. Sorry, I've got to move y'all around here. So we've covered the James Lange. So again, our awareness of our body response is to this sort of emotion arousing stimuli. So the example here would we observe our heart racing after a threat and then we feel afraid. The Cannon-Bard would say they come about simultaneously, so our heart races as we experience fear. The Schachter-Singer theory would be that arousal could be labeled as a fear or as excitement, depending on the context, right? And so this is where you get into that sort of appraisal of the arousal. Do you see it as something that should be feared or could cause harm? Or do you see it as a representation of your excitement? right? And so one way you can actually help combat some of your own anxieties is by saying, instead of saying, oh, I'm really nervous for this exam, say, I'm excited for this exam, right? And by purely reframing and rephrasing your subjective experience, you can reduce your anxiety for things that are happening in your world. I have no idea how to say this first name. Zajunk. If anybody knows how to say it, let me know. But this theory, Z and Ledoux, suggests that our emotions are taking place. We automatically are reacting to the sound that we would be experiencing in the forest before appraising it, right? And so we have that sort of reaction. We have not only the arousal, we have the reaction, and then we appraise it. And then the Lazarus theory of emotions suggests that sometimes we're not even consciously aware of our appraisal. We're just kind of consistently attributing either a harmful stimulus or a harmful thing in our environment, or a benign, and it's just occurring sometimes without that sort of conscious awareness. And so, for example, you understanding that a sound is just the wind rather than something you need to think about, okay, is this a potentially harmful stimulus, or is this a benign stimulus? I'm going to pause real quick because I'm going through a lot of this really quickly. If you have any questions, type them into that Zoom chat box. All right, I'm going to continue, but if you do have a question, feel free to keep typing it, and I will get back to it. All right, so my recollection is that Jonathan talked to y'all a little bit about your central nervous system on last Thursday. Excuse me. There's something about this comfortable chair here that's going to make me fall asleep in the middle of the lecture. So somebody has to unmute themselves and yell at me if I do fall asleep. So talking about our autonomic nervous system can be broken into essentially two different categories: a sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division. Right? And so the sympathetic response is your kind of fight or flight response. Pupils dilate, your salivation decreases, your skin starts perspiring, you are increasing your respiration rate, increase in heart rate, slow down in digestion, you're increasing those stress hormones like adrenaline, and then your immune function, your immune system functioning decreases, right? And so what it's doing is prioritizing all of these absolutely essential functions for your immediate survival, right? And so by decreasing digestion, it's now taking energy to be able to redirect it to other functions like increasing your heart rate, increasing your respiration, getting you ready to fight or flee. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, is kind of reprioritizing everything that was neglected, right? And so after a sympathetic reaction to something, you're eventually going to have a parasympathetic reaction, right? And so you can think about this you've got sympathetic nervous system activation before you go take your final exam. You're, at the heightened level of arousal. You are perhaps even a little afraid. And then after you finish taking that exam, you have this sort of parasympathetic backlash where you may get really sleepy. Excuse me, even just saying the word sleepy is making me trying to yawn here. But you start having a reprioritization of those things that you were neglecting, like digestion. Your immune system now is ready to fight off whatever the bacteria you have. So while you're stressed, your immune system kind of suppresses any of its attempts to fight whatever that illness would be. And then once you start coming off of that sympathetic response, your body starts trying to fight those bugs that you picked up. And so that's why if you've ever gone home at the end of finals and a day or two into break, you start feeling sick, it's because now you've come off of that sympathetic experience and you're having this sort of parasympathetic dealing with the bugs you were exposed to, but not actually addressing while you were stressed. Yeah, so just thinking critically, critical thinking activities where I'm going to have you talk to your neighbor are a little less practical when we're all remote here, but just think critically about kind of what is that evolutionary benefit afforded by each of those sympathetic nervous system responses. How are we doing on slides here? Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord, Lord. All right. I'm being particularly verbose today, which is not good with everything we've got to get through. All right. So one question could be, do all cultures experience emotion and interpret emotion the same way as we do here in the West? And for the most part, yes. So one of the things some researchers did was take a series of pictures from these isolated tribes. I don't remember exactly where, but they were nomadic tribes isolated from the outside world, and asked them to exhibit certain expressions, right? So an expression for anger, for happiness, for sadness, for disgust. And they took pictures of those, but they also brought pictures of Westerners who were showing those emotions. And what they found is, for the most part, people do have kind of this universal expression of certain emotions. And now, that being said, there are certain nuances and idiosyncrasies, but, excuse me, for the most part, think about like a baby developing, right? So a baby is smiling before they know what smiling is, right? They're deriving pleasure from certain things and are smiling in response. And so these sorts of responses tend to be somewhat universal across cultures. There are culturally different expressions, however. So to give you one extreme example, back in, when was it? You may have been 2012. I was in Russia. I took a cruise and we went around to all these different countries. One of the countries we went to was Russia. And one of the things I was shocked about was how stoic Russians are in public, right? I'm used to smiling at people, nodding, at least exchanging some sort of pleasantries. But Russians wanted absolutely nothing to do with that, to the point where I couldn't tell if they hated me and everybody I was with, or if that was just part of the experience. But talking to a couple of Russian friends of mine, they were saying, no, this is kind of an ingrained cultural expression that derives largely from the days of the KGB, right? And so they wanted to not give away anything about themselves. They had to be really reserved and really closed. And this is carried on into present day, wherein you still get kind of this complete lack of pleasantries with people out in public. You also see this in a difference between Southerners and Northerners. So for any of y'all who are not from the South, it may have been somewhat of a cultural experience to come down South and have people, wave at you on the street or exchange pleasantries with you in very frequently. And I always remember, so I grew up in Virginia and then lived in Alabama for a little bit before I went to grad school. And I had a good friend of mine who was only born and raised in the North, and he came down and he was shocked that people he didn't know kept waving to us. People I didn't know kept waving to us, right? And so this kind of Southern hospitality, that sort of greeting, is another kind of quintessential difference in across these cultures, right? And you may not get that if you go to, for example, New York City, not to stereotype, but you'll probably get a lot more averted glances and kind of stern expressions on people's faces. However, We do tend to interpret facial expressions as a function of the context they are in. So it's not just that we can pick up on the facial expressions, but we do take kind of environmental cues. And so here's an example, 4 different pictures, all with the same face, and your perception of what this person is experiencing is largely going to differ as a function of what is taking place in their environment. So up here in box A, you may feel that this person is experiencing disgust. Whoopsies. In B, you may feel as though he's experiencing anger, sadness in C, and perhaps fright in D, or fear in D. So again, even though it's the same facial expression in each one of these, we're reliant on these sorts of environmental cues to help inform us what we are seeing in the world. And a great example of this is this visual illusion. I love this visual illusion for a couple different reasons. One, the actual size of this monster or this robot, whatever you want to call it, up here is the exact same size as the size of this monster and robot back there. If you don't believe me, print it out on a piece of paper and you can cut them out and you'll see if they're actually the same size, even though this one looks significantly bigger. But in the context of emotions, if you look at this face and you look at this face, you may, in something that has more than 3 pixels in it, see that or perceive this face as being fear and this as being kind of aggression, even though it is the exact same face, right? This is just a carbon copy back and forth here. But your perceptions of the facial expressions differ as a function of the environment. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the Zoom chat box there. I'm going to pause for just a second because I'm flying through some of this stuff. All right. So in the context of emotions, we also have what we call feedback effects, or sometimes also called embodied cognition. And it's this idea that you can't separate the brain or your subjective experience of things from your actual body. And so in kind of the pioneering study of this sort of embodied cognition or feedback effects, they had participants read a comic strip or look through a comic strip while doing one of 2 things. They either put a pin in their teeth and told them to bite down with their teeth like that, or they told them to hold the pin in their lips and just purse their lips down without biting on it with their teeth. And they gave them a series of comic strips and asked them to rate their subjective experience of humor of these comic strips. So essentially, how funny were these comic strips? What they found is that those who were in the teeth condition found the comic strips to be significantly funnier than did those who were in the lip condition here. And the authors suggested it's because you are essentially mimicking a smile in this teeth condition, right? And so biting down on something with just your teeth, not your lips, mimics very much how you would look if you were actually smiling. In the lip condition, this is activating the same sort of muscles you would be activating if you were frowning, right? So you can actually do this yourself. If you do have a pen, just put it in your lips and kind of purse your lips around it, and you'll actually have that sort of feeling of what the muscle activation is. And so again, the idea here is that your body is taking your brain is taking information from your body to feed it back into your appraisal of what's going on. And so you have that sort of arousal experience, right? So your heart rate spikes, and then you start to appraise that event, stimuli, to see what that does for your subjective experience of if it's something to be afraid of or is relatively benign. And again, you're doing it here with actual facial expressions. So a good way to demonstrate this is, again, how much happier you can get if you watch, for example, bloopers of your favorite show, right? If you start laughing, your body is receiving that input from your face that you're happy and starts feeding it back into your cognitive experience. So getting yourself to smile causes you to feel happier than if you are not smiling. And this also has the added effect of people like to mirror the expressions that they see. So smiling at other people make them smile back at you, which increases their subjective experience of liking of you, right? So you can actually smile at people and make them like you more just by smiling at them, because they will frequently smile back. They then appraise, why am I smiling? Well, it must be because I like whoever this person is. And so you are affecting their subjective experience and their perceptions of you in that way. You also get these feedback effects from these kind of gross or big body movements, excuse me. So a researcher had participants adopt one of two types of poses. What they called either a high power body language pose or a low power body language pose. And so the high power body pose in the top is this very kind of open, right? You can see everybody is kind of allowing themselves to be open. They are increasing their sort of surface area, so to speak. They are not kind of balling up and being timid. Whereas in the bottom row, they did have people actually ball up. You can see them kind of cross their arms. You can see them kind of guarding their neck. You can see them kind of hunched over here. And what they found was that those who adopted the high power pose actually had an increase in testosterone and a decrease in cortisol, right? So cortisol is that stress hormone. So people were actually able to make themselves less stressed by adopting this sort of high power pose. Now, why would that be, right? And so we can think about what each of these sort of high power poses mean in relationship to these low power poses. For example, guarding your neck is something people tend to do when they're afraid, right? And so if you ever watch somebody who gets caught in a lie, for example, they may start guarding their neck, right? And this is kind of an evolutionary benefit to start protecting some of your vital organism or your vital organs or vital parts of your body when you are fearful in a certain situation. Whereas adopting this high power pose leaves you really open, right? Your body, your mind is interpreting your body's open power pose as being an indication that there are not threats around. And so the open high power pose leads to increases in testosterone, decreases in cortisol, whereas the low power pose down here leads to increases in cortisol and decreases in testosterone. So as I already said, smiling at people gets them to smile back. We've also, I think, already talked about this concept, but people are inherently reliant on the expressions or emotions of others, right? And that's why if somebody starts laughing, you tend to start laughing too, right? You may have had the experience where one of your friends gets the uncontrollable giggles and everybody starts laughing. It is one of these indications where we want to kind of model the behavior or the emotions of those around us. And so one of the phenomena you have is where babies will sometimes fall and hit their heads. They'll look at their parents, not just their heads, but they'll look at their parents and see how their parents reacting. And if that parent starts smiling at that kid, the kid is less likely to cry than if that parent starts looking really concerned, right? So that kid is looking for some sort of indication from the parent about what's going on and how they should navigate that situation. So, by and large, smile at people will make people happier. People will like you more. You'll be happier. Life gets a lot more awesome when you smile. All right, on to stress. We're going to very briefly touch on some things because I know Jonathan talked about stress on Thursday. But one of the things I want to talk about is exposure to prolonged stress. So long periods of stress leads to a certain part of your body we call telomeres shortening, right? And so the telomeres themselves are one of the greatest indications we have about somebody's actual, like, uh, essentially biological age. So there's a pretty good correlation between your actual age, but also increased stress leads to shrinking of these telomeres. And these shrinking of the telomeres lead to various physical effects, such as increased wrinkling. It leads to decreases in actual physical health. And so there are a lot of medical trials that are looking at ways in which we can actually elongate telomeres to sort of reverse the effects of aging. And so this telomere shrinking occurs with prolonged exposure to stress. And just for a great example of this, you can look at pictures of our various presidents from before they took office and after. One example would be President Obama. I mean, look how young and youthful he looks in 2008 when he was on the campaign trail. Look how relatively old he looks in 2016. Now, some of that could be hair. It's possible I don't know that he dyed his hair, but it's possible he could have dyed his hair in 2008. But also just look at all the increased wrinkles and bags around the eyes, around the lips, the face, etc. Right? And so you can see a really concrete example of what this prolonged exposure to stress does to the human body, just looking at President Obama. Another example would be President Lincoln. So this is just a 4-year difference, right? And this is washed out a little bit, but you can see the amount of difference in, for example, the eyes here, the additional wrinkles, the wrinkles in the cheeks and the face, the depth of those wrinkles. And so you get a really good example, again, of what this stress does to the human body, in this case, in only 4 years while he was in office. All right, I'm going to pause real quick. If you have any questions, type them in that Zoom chat box. Here's another fun fact for you. Apparently, President Lincoln, a week that he was actually assassinated, had a dream that he was going to be assassinated at Ford's Theater. It's a little eerie. I think his dream was that he came down in the White House and saw his own body in the casket and found out that he had been assassinated. Very weird. All right, so I think Jonathan talked to y'all about the general stress response of fight or flight, and that does tend to be, at least in really immediate, extreme, high stress situations, the response, but there are differences in stress response by genders. So women under stress kind of tend towards this behavior we call tend and befriend. So women, much more so than men, tend to provide support to others, but also bond with and seek support from others. Whereas men under stress tend to withdraw socially. This is one of the examples why women tend to be better at forming really close relationships with others than do men. And men tend to only have, now there are obvious exceptions, but the kind of quintessential man tends to only develop a really close relationship with their wives. And so this is one of the reasons why, if any of you have had grandparents where your grandma has died, but your grandpa has lived, within a year, the top two responses for men who are married is one, either unfortunately die or get remarried. So whereas women tend to outlive their husbands a lot longer, men tend to either pass relatively shortly after their wives pass or get remarried. And this remarriage tends to be that sort of adaptation to getting that social support, right? And it's so common. I'm sure some of you may have even had this experience with potentially your parents, but understanding that this is a natural process. It leads to a lot of conflict in families, but because men tend to have that one really close confidant, whereas women are good about reaching out to a variety of people and building a social network, men tend to have just one or a couple very close relationships. That's why women tend to live longer too. They tend to be healthier in that regard. But across genders, one of the biggest things for people's stress responses is personal control, right? A lot of us feel helpless or hopeless or depressed after experiencing a series of bad events beyond our control, right? I'm sure that a lot of y'all are feeling, in light of what's going on with the coronavirus, a certain helplessness and anxiety and depression associated with what's going on. Part of that may be manifesting in a denial response, right? And so some of y'all may be saying, oh, it's not that bad. I don't need to socially isolate. Let's go out to the bars and stuff like that. That tends to be part of that sort of response to that loss of freedom, etc. But when we feel helpless or hopeless or depressed, and we're not being proactive about it, we can have the situation that we call learned helplessness. And so one of the ways that they've studied this learned helplessness is by putting a dog in a cage, and they would deliver a shock to that cage, which would transfer to the dog's paws after a handful of, sorry, somebody's pulling up my driveway. I think it may be the mailman, but the dogs are about to start barking. So just FYI. They put the dogs in a cage. That cage was shocked every so often, and the dog would learn it couldn't escape. Later, even when they took the top off to allow that dog to escape in response to that shock, the dog didn't, right? It learned this kind of helplessness. It learned that it couldn't do anything in that situation. And so even when it could, it kind of learned this woe is me kind of mentality, right? People love to have control. And it's why one of the best things in response to anxiety is developing this focus of control, right? And so in response to what's going on with the coronavirus, focus on that control that you do have. Focus on being proactive with washing your hands, practicing that social isolation. But also think about the things in life you can control. Okay, now I've got all this extra time to go read a book if I really want to. I have the opportunity to, focus on rebuilding a lot of personal relationships, close relationships, etc. And so you have that opportunity to avoid that sort of learned helplessness. Part of this is what we call locus of control, right? So sorry, the dogs are barking, as I told you they would. The locus of control is such that, do I think things are in my control or out of my control? So if somebody has what we call an external locus of control, the perception is that things that are happening are just by chance or outside forces and things I can't control or don't have any sort of effect over. Whereas an internal locus of control is this belief that, we control our own fate. We've got some hand to play in what's going on, right? And so focusing on developing this internal locus of control is a much healthier response to stress, right? There are obviously going to be things outside of our control, but we do want to have some degree of feeling of autonomy because it allows us to be empowered to actually act in certain situations. Self-control, on the other hand, is that ability to control impulses and delay the short-term gratification for long-term rewards, right? And so we talked about earlier this semester the marshmallow example of kids. And so the marshmallow example, they gave kids one marshmallow on a plate, and the experimenter was about to leave the room and said, if you don't eat this marshmallow until I return, I'll give you another marshmallow so you can have two marshmallows. But if you eat this marshmallow while I'm gone, you only get that one marshmallow. And so they ran this test with the kids, and then they tracked them throughout their life. And what they found is that those who were able to delay that gratification, who waited until they could get the second marshmallow, tended to be more successful later on in life. So developing that sort of self-control to forego pleasure now in response to pleasure, greater pleasure in the long-term, short-term sacrifices for long-term gains, etc. And there's also the distinction between optimism and pessimism, right? So we're all familiar with the distinction, the difference between the two of them. And colloquially, our definition of optimism and pessimism tends to be pretty accurate. But optimism itself leads to a lot better overall outcomes, right? It leads to better health, better performance on a variety of tasks in life, greater life satisfaction, greater positive emotions, right? Thinking about, okay, what is the good that's going to come of bad situations, or what are the variety of good potential outcomes, etc. It's also kind of the snowballing effect. So your worldview leads to a confirmation bias, right? Your optimism leads you to find more optimistic pieces of information, news, etc., which leads you to become more optimistic, which leads you to find more good stuff, more optimistic, etc. But that also plays into pessimism, right? So if you're pessimistic, you look for reasons to be pessimistic, which leads you to be more pessimistic, which leads you to find more reasons to be pessimistic, etc. And so you have the opportunity to affect your worldview. And so when I say things like, by and large, happiness is a choice, obvious examples where it's not a choice, and there are very positive reactions. It's positive to have negative reactions to negative things, but by and large, being optimist, focusing on the good, allows you to be happier overall, wind up having better health in the long run, greater satisfaction, greater positive emotions, greater performance in life, etc. And so, it becomes really easy to focus on the, kind of the bad in the world, right? It becomes really easy to think about, oh, Jesus, we are in the midst of, something that will be written about in history books in the decades to come. But what are the good things in life, right? So there is a book by a researcher at, I think, Harvard named Steven Pinker. And his whole book is essentially about how things are better now than they've ever been in the past. And here are just some of the examples, right? If you look at illiterate populations across the world, I think most of us would agree that literacy is a good thing. We should strive for literacy. You can see in 1800, the literacy rate was at about 10%, right? 10 to 15% of people could read. Even if we split this at about 1900, we've only got about 20% of people who can actually read. However, over the last century, that literacy rate has increased dramatically, such that now only about 10 to 15% of the world is unable to read. That's an incredible statistic. You can also look at average life expectancy, right? And so the average life expectancy in the 1700s in the Americas, excuse me, was mid 30s, late 30s. Now, part of that is the actual health of adults, but a massive part of that is actual life expectancy of children, right? So less children are dying during childbirth or during infancy. And you've now got to the point where the overall average life expectancy is pushing 80 in the US and across the world. Increases in medicine with increases in healthcare, etc. Right? And a good example of this right now is there is a current antiviral drug in late stage testing across the world that was initially developed for Ebola, but they found it has really strong effects against some of these coronavirus type or these respiratory diseases. And so there's been some really promising early results. It's in late stage testing now, and we should have results in the next couple weeks. But thinking about this kind of prevalence of medication wherein we can help combat some of these threats to life expectancy with these medicines, with these capabilities, with the advancement of care, with the advancement of literacy, being able to push out information and tell people, yeah, maybe we should all stay home for a few weeks, etc. And then, my favorite graph, you look at the world GDP across the last 2 millennia, right? So the average, essentially, wealth across the world for the individuals in the world hovers at virtually next to nothing until you start getting to the Industrial Revolution. That Industrial Revolution now kickstarts it such that, I don't know if that Zoom chat's in y'all's way, but it is in my way, such that you've got almost this complete vertical, complete vertical line, come on now, complete vertical line demonstrating the overwhelming amount of wealth that exists. Right? And so think about this even in terms of like your iPhone. You have more access, doesn't have to be iPhone, any smartphone or the internet, you have access to more information with your phone than anybody in history has ever had before, right? This distribution of information is incredible. And part of that is just making this access a lot cheaper relative to everything else. You know, the computational capabilities of these systems, the overall wealth and the prevalence of food, etc., is really remarkable over what has happened over the last couple of 100 years. So it's not all bad. You can always find these reasons to be optimistic. All right, I've got 25 minutes to get through everything about drives here. So we're going to quickly go through it. Here's a third fun fact of the day because I like y'all so much, I figured I would add a third one. A computer programmer once hired a woman at $8 an hour to slap him in the face every time he tried checking Facebook during working hours. I think I could use that, although I'm not going to pay anybody and I don't want to be slapped. So I think there are apps out there that are free. You can have, and I'll let you know. All right, so talking about sex hormones. The two primary sex hormones are testosterone and estrogen. And during this prenatal period, this prenatal development, they direct our development as either male or female. Now, there are outlier cases of being like intersex, but by and large, the amount of testosterone and the amount of estrogen are driving this actual physical development in your prenatal self. During puberty, that sex hormone surges and ushers us into adolescence. I don't need to tell you all about the physical changes associated with adolescence. And then after puberty and well into your late adult years, those sex hormones facilitate sexual behavior. So, for example, people with low testosterone, men with low testosterone, and even a degree, women with low testosterone tend to have lower sexual drives and lower sexual behavior compared to those with higher levels of testosterone. So I don't know why I decided to animate this one. So your sexuality is primarily determined by your sexual identity, and your sexual identity is very much so directed by a combination of genes and hormones, right? These genes and hormones are affecting things like attraction, your dating, your sexual motivation, your mating. And one of the best examples of this is couples who are in committed relationships, particularly heterosexual couples in committed relationships. Women's level of estrogen tends to increase during ovulation. And men are able to pick up on subtle cues of these changes in estrogen, whether or not they're consciously aware of it, which are signaling both receptivity of the ability to reproduce, but also a higher sexual drive for women, and you tend to have somewhat of an increase in sexual drive for men. And so, like I said, these two key sex hormones are testosterone and estrogen. Primarily, testosterone is the more masculine. Primarily, estrogen is the more feminine, although people do have both. So, for testosterone, women have much less testosterone than do men, but they do have certain levels of actual testosterone. And apparently, according to a variety of studies, female humans are more receptive to their changes in testosterone levels than are females of other species. If a woman's natural testosterone level drops, like I said with men, you also tend to have a decrease in their sexual interest and sexual desires. And one of the ways you can treat this, especially in men with low testosterone, is testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT, you may have heard. It often increases sexual desire, but also things like energy and vitality. And so you'll sometimes see drug commercials online or for TRT and talking about the symptoms of low T or low testosterone being low energy, low vitality, and you can actually increase this by increasing testosterone. So for the most part, estrogen is what's affecting the female's sexual drives. Women become more sexually receptive when their estrogens peak at ovulation. But you can also cause females to become more receptive by injecting them with estrogens. And no, I'm not saying female women don't go injecting your girlfriend guys with estrogen, not ethical. But you can do this with a variety of animals and make them more likely to be receptive and ready to reproduce. You do have surges in estrogen and testosterone at ovulation, so it's not just the estrogen. And I already said this last point. We're going to keep breezing through here to make sure we get through everything. If you have questions, please again type them in the chat box. And so there is, again, the sort of biopsychosocial influence on sexual motivation, right? We kind of talked about that biological influence, so the sexual maturity, which is including that sex hormones and testosterone, right? So whereas kids tend not to have many sexual desires, once you start reaching puberty, and you have this spike in testosterone for guys, for example, you tend to have a lot more of this kind of sexual motivation, sexual desire. But you also have these psychological influences, right? So exposure to stimulating conditions, right? You can even think about erotic novels, for example, can increase somebody's actual sexual motivation or sexual arousal, those sexual fantasies. And then you have social cultural influences. So for example, family and society values, religious and personal values. So for example, premarital sex versus staying celibate until you're married, cultural expectations, and then also how it's depicted in the media. So there are several different main sexual dysfunction. There are more than what are on this list. But the most common sexual dysfunction is, for men, erectile dysfunction. And I'm sure you all are familiar with the concept and various treatments. There are a lot of things that can cause erectile dysfunction, everything from stress to excessive alcohol use, to smoking, to various blood pressure disorders, etc. Various other medications can cause erectile dysfunction. The most common sexual dysfunction in women is what's known as the female orgasmic disorder. And this is the inability to experience an orgasm or distress over it. And one of the things we'll talk about in just a second is why that may be. To kind of preview that, women tend to get most sexual gratification out of close relationships. And so women tend not to find one-night stands as sexually gratifying and can frequently have this sort of sexual dysfunction as a function of that sort of hookup culture. And then you also have these paraphilias, right? So sexual disorders involving, what somebody is attracted to. So necrophilia or pedophilia are two examples. And this is kind of this disorder, this crossing of wires of sexual attraction. And so, like I said, sexual orientation is largely driven by genetic and hormonal responses. And one of the ways we can tell this is compared to heterosexuals, gay men tend to, on average, have more of what we would call kind of female typical brain pattern responses. Whereas lesbian women tend to have more male typical brain pattern responses. This kind of all suggests that there is this genetic influence. So there may be somewhat of a gay gene. Now, again, we've talked about nothing is ever all nature or all nurture. So there is interactions with one's environment that can affect the manifestation of that genetic influence, but there does seem to be a substantial genetic influence. The hormones during development can also play a role, as can birth order. And so when you look at the numbers, every subsequent male child that a woman has is more likely to be gay than his older brothers. And one of the reasons this is believed to be the case is because spikes in testosterone, associated with male prenatal development are relatively foreign to the female body. And so the female body starts building up a sort of response to the increase in testosterone, such that it is subsequently potentially lowering testosterone for each subsequent male, which in response is lowering this sort of male typical development of, for example, the brain, and making it more along the lines of the kind of female typical brain responses. Now, that isn't to say, somebody with 6 boys, the 7th is going to turn out gay, because again, everything is a nature and nurture interaction. But there does seem to be some influence of hormones in that development, and part of that hormonal effect can be birth order. And then here are just different examples of what led people to start looking for the actual, so to speak, gay gene, right? So things in spatial abilities, fingerprint ridge counts, auditory system development, handedness, occupational preferences, relative finger lengths, etc. All these things that have a substantial, if not complete, genetic component suggest that there must be some sort of genetic influence in the actual sexual orientation of an individual. So you also see brain differences, genetic influences, prenatal influences, etc. So you can just look through those. All right, 14 minutes. How are we doing on? Oh man, I am speeding up quickly. All right. So as far as sex and relationships, there seems to be a substantial body of literature suggesting that actually holding off on sex is better for relationships. And so later first sex tends to predict greater satisfaction in one's marriage or partnership. Again, this is not to say whatever your morals are, but this is to say what the research suggests, and that is by postponing sexual intercourse, people tend to subsequently have greater satisfaction in one's marriage and partnership. Those whose relationship first developed that sort of deep commitment tended to not only report that sort of greater relationship satisfaction and relationship stability, marriage stability, but also tended to report better sexual experiences in that marriage. And this is holding true for both men and women, but especially for women. Sex tends to be more satisfying and gratifying in committed relationships. I don't know why I spelled relationships with a Y there. That shouldn't be anything. But yeah, so these sexual relationships do tend to be more satisfying and gratifying in committed relationships. And one of the reasons why sex can be complicating in non-relationships is because your brain releases various hormones in response to an orgasm. And one of those is, I'm totally blanking on the name of it right now. All right, if I can remember it, I will let you know. That won't be on the exam. But one of those hormones is what's kind of colloquially known as the love hormone, right? And so increases in oxytocin, that's what it is, oxytocin. Increases in oxytocin tend to increase this sort of bond. And that's why it's sometimes hard to maintain that balance between friends with benefits and relationships in a hookup culture. All right, on to motivation really quickly. Motivation, exactly what you would think. Why do we do what we do? Motivation is that need or desire that energizes and directs our behavior. So for example, it's that need or desire, that's that thirst or desire to drink that directs our subsequent behavior. And motivation drives that both kind of low-level needs and high-level needs, right? So you can have these basic desires for survival that you're motivating for, the feelings of hunger, the feelings of thirst, feelings of sexual arousal, but then also kind of higher level needs that you have as well. So one kind of theory around this drive is that individuals are consistently trying to reach this, what we call internal homeostasis. So internal homeostasis means a resolution of sorts of conflict or tension, right? So think about kind of that tension associated with you feel like you have to sneeze, and not sneezing is, excuse me, a lack of that resolution. So a need creates a sort of state of arousal or tension, which motivates that individual to satisfy that need, right? You have the need, you have that thirst, which leads you to take a sip of water, and then your reward center will release dopamine, creating that sense of satisfaction associated with water. And that's why you'll hear people after they've gone on a long run or really sweaty or it's really hot outside, just feel completely refreshed by drinking water. It's that resolution of that tension. And so again, you have this need, example for food or water. You have that drive, that hunger or thirst. And then you have, excuse me, this chair's too comfortable. You then have that drive reducing behavior, so that eating or drinking. All right. Abraham Maslow came up with this sort of pyramid or hierarchy of needs. And the way to interpret this graph is that everything above builds on what is below. And Maslow says you can't move on to subsequent stages until all the previous stages have been met. So, for example, you can't worry about your safety needs until you've satisfied your hunger and thirst. You can't focus on your belongingness and love needs until you've satisfied your safety needs, etc. And Maslow suggests that kind of our highest stages, or these final stages that we can all hope to get to, but not that everybody does get to, are self-actualization needs and self-transcendent needs. And so the self-actualization needs is need to live up to our fullest and unique potential, feeling like we are making a change in the world, feeling like we are doing something good, and we are providing some sort of unique benefit to society. On top of that is this sort of transcendent need, or the self-transcendence need. And it's that need to find meaning and identity beyond the self, right? What does it mean to be alive, right? These kind of almost very philosophical questions. And this is one of the reasons why you'll see, for example, a lot of psychologists preaching things like free or reduced price lunches for kids in school, right? Because if you're not able to satisfy that physiological need and then subsequently that safety need, it's hard for these students to work on developing that sort of healthy relationships that we talked about, I guess it was last week, that are necessary for becoming a healthy and contributing adult. So again, for this, you can spend more time looking at it, but know that to get to, for example, self-actualization, you need to have met your esteem needs, your belongingness and love needs, your safety needs, and your physiological needs as well. And so we've talked before about motivation in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, but just a really quick refresh. Extrinsic is anything that comes from those sorts of external sources. So money, rewards, praise, etc. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. So example, sense of achievement, your sense of happiness, your sense of enjoyment about doing something. So doing something for you, not because there's any sort of outside reward. Is this the, yes, this is the last slide. All right, if y'all have any questions, go ahead and start typing them into the chat box. And the final concept is grit. And so grit is this idea of passion and perseverance in the pursuit of long-term goals, right? So you're going to come in contact with various hiccups, and it's that persevering through those actual hiccups that is what determines grit. And grit predicts a tremendous amount of success, including educational attainment for adults, right? So understanding you're going to have educational hiccups, persevering through those educational hiccups. When they've done this at Ivy League schools, it is a good predictor of grade point average, right? So dealing with those hiccups, pushing through those tough times. Retention at military academies, and so those with higher grit are more likely to stick around at the military academies than are those with lower grit who are higher predisposed to dropping out. And then also ranking in the National Spelling Bee. And so you can see grit as a construct being representative of this success in the face of hardship. And so you are not only getting to the point of hardship and not only trying to deal with hardship, but continuing to push through, continuing your passion and perseverance in kind of handling a lot of those hiccups. So thank you all for bearing with me on that rush through the variety of slides. I'm going to stick around. If y'all have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Again, we are not going to have class on Thursday because UAH has canceled class on Thursday, Friday, and Monday. On Tuesday, I will do our review session. The exam will still be multiple choice. For the most part, there may be some fill in the blanks or short answer, stuff like that. But by and large, it will still be multiple choice. And the exam is going to be on a week from Thursday. I'm going to hang around if any of y'all have any other questions. Otherwise, we are done for the day. A week from this Thursday, correct. So what is that? That'll be the 26th, and it will be during the actual class time. Thanks, Caleb. You too. Everybody try to relax a little bit and find joy in what could otherwise be a stressful situation. Watch The Office. Maybe I'll make that a homework assignment. Everybody has to watch at least one episode of The Office. Yes, Colton, I will bring the dogs in. Viviana, you do not need to have cameras during the test. We're not going to do any of the respondus lockdown stuff like that. All right, fine. I won't assign The Office. Somebody hates fun and laughter. But yeah, you won't need to have the actual cameras. It's going to be open book, open note, etc. Oh, you just hanging out there, man, huh? They want to see you again, huh? They want to see you. Can you say hi? Can you say hi? Can you say hi? Oopsies. What did I do over there? Would preparing with flashcards still be beneficial for this open book exam? What other ways should we be studying for the open book exam? Yes, you're still going to want to study. Flashcards are good, although one of the things I've noticed that people have been making a mistake with is writing down kind of verbatim answers on the back of the flashcard. And so there will be a prompt and then their verbatim answer, and they'll just kind of memorize like one or two word associations rather than the concept, right? So you really want to make sure that with the flashcards, you're focusing on the concept rather than the definition, right? Because as you may have noticed, I asked very few definition questions. What I'm asking is about the concept, right? So understanding what does Maslow's hierarchy mean? And so your best bet for this and all your other exams is going to be essentially just writing on a sheet of paper, what do I know about drives? Write down everything I know about drives. Okay, I know about Hole's drive reduction or need reduction. What do I know about that? Okay, well, there's a tension and I have to resolve this tension. And just keep filling in things like that, and then go backfill or go look at your notes and compare it to what you just wrote and see what you're missing and start trying to work that into your mental model. For the open book exam, again, you're going to want to make sure you study because you're not going to have enough time to go look it up. These questions aren't going to be verbatim in the book. And it's going to require you have kind of a concept, an understanding of that concept. And so really make sure you are studying kind of that, the totality of the construct, understanding how it relates to different things in life, and start applying it. And then you want to make sure, if you're going to be using your notes or book for very few things, you've got them organized in a way that you can quickly reference them and then get back to the actual exam. What are the chapters that will be on this exam? It's going to be everything from the last exam. So let me pull it up real quick. Oops, wrong class. Probably don't want to take my 102 exam, do you? All right, it's going to be chapter 9, chapter 13, chapter 12, and chapter 10. And for, again, those who are watching now, the chapter 13 and chapter 9 have been extended until the 13th of April in Seniage. You too, Viviana. So in psychology, what is a different way to say intersex or hermaphrodite individual? That's a good question. I don't know the actual answer to that. I mean, that is a population that I don't deal with all that frequently. My understanding is that intersex is the kind of appropriate medical term, but I don't actually know. So if anybody does know, please feel free to chime in or educate us in the frequently asked questions area. Will information in the exam be split up evenly between the book and the lectures? Yeah, it will probably be a little heavy on the lectures, although a lot of what's in the lectures is also in the book. So, you too, Matthew. Thanks, you too, Denver. You too, whoever ICLM2 is.